The Japanese village that rang bells to welcome the rain. Section 1. In a quiet valley, nestled between the soft, sloping hills of old Japan, just south of what is now Niigata. It had no great castle, no famous shrine, and no remarkable harvests. Its rice was ordinary. Its people were kind but unexceptional. And yet, for nearly 2 centuries, this tiny village developed and maintained one of the gentlest weather traditions. In Japanese history, they rang bells not during storms, but before them, specifically to welcome the rain. You might imagine a large ceremonial gong or a temple bell. But these were not grand bells. They were hand-sized, often strung with bits of colored cloth, each producing a soft, dull chime, not unlike the sound of wind moving through hollow bamboo. These bells were not rung to ward off rain, or to warn of floods, or even to pray for sun, as many neighboring villages did. No, they were rung as a form of greeting, a kind of hospitality offered to the clouds. This tradition, called aim no ken pai, which roughly translates to rain toast or rain salutation, began sometime in the early 1600s, according to the village's only surviving recorded collection of household notes, kept by a local herbalist. The practice started during a year of quiet drought. It wasn't a deadly one. There was enough water for drinking. But the rice stalks drooped, and the tea plant stiffened in protest. The villagers, unsure of what else to do, gathered one morning and began to ring their house bells together, just softly in the open air. They didn't plead with the heavens. They didn't ask for rescue. They simply rang the bells and sat in silence. It rained that afternoon, and so began a sleepy tradition passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from apothecary to apprentice, from teacher to student, until no one quite remembered when it had begun. The rain bell gatherings happened only when the air felt heavy, and the frogs grew quiet, and the skies threatened mist. It was never scheduled. There was no priest or leader. Villagers simply listened for the first bell. Then another would join, and soon a chorus of soft chimes floated across the narrow rice fields like smoke from a warm stove. These weren't religious events, nor particularly social. People stood far apart on porches or in gardens facing the hills. Some said it was to greet the dragon of rain respectfully. Others insisted it was to let the crops know they were not alone. One old woman claimed it helped remind the clouds that someone was still listening. The bells were often made at home. Children carved them from pine or cherry, sometimes using discarded bits of tin. The wealthier households commissioned a bell from a traveling blacksmith in the region once a decade. These were precious things, often painted with indigo or wrapped in strips of old family fabric. They were not passed down with pride, like a sword or a calligraphy scroll, but with quiet familiarity, like a teacup or a worn cushion. Most households kept the bell near the door or tucked into the garden wall. Some hung them beside the chicken coops. One family, known for their stubborn roosters, claimed the bell worked better than feed at calming the birds during storm season. There were no records of the exact origin of Aim no Kanpai, and no nearby village had a similar custom. However, the practice endured well into the late 1800s, until the Meiji Restoration changed the rhythms of rural life. With modernization came louder sounds: train whistles, factory bells, school chimes. The village gradually shrank. Young people moved away, and the bells, both the physical ones and the custom, began to fall silent. But during its quiet reign, the practice shaped daily life in subtle ways. People prepared for rain by brushing the dust off their bells, sometimes even polishing them with rice water. Children learned to recognize the signs of approaching weather, not just by looking at the sky, but by listening, not for thunder, but for the first faint chime. Interestingly, it wasn't just about the bells themselves. It was about the timing, the attitude, the posture. People didn't run from the rain. They bowed to it. Farmers planted their feet firmly in the soil, held the bell loosely in one hand, and faced the mountains. The ceremony, if it can be called that, lasted no more than 5 or 10 minutes. And when the rain came, as it often did, no one cheered. They simply stepped inside, warmed some barley tea, and went on with their lives. Yet there's something quietly revolutionary about this kind of patience. This belief that rain deserved acknowledgement, not command. That water from the sky was a guest to be greeted, not a force to be battled. What made this village different from the thousands of others across Japan that also depended on the weather? Why did this custom of ringing bells develop here and nowhere else, perhaps like the rain itself? The answer is both simple and elusive. Section 2, to better understand the peculiar calm of this rain bell tradition. We must step deeper into the rhythm of life in the village, what it meant to live each season, not just with the weather, but in conversation with it. The village was small, perhaps only 30 or 40 families at any given time. It sat between a wooded hillside and a narrow valley stream that fed the paddies. Like most rural Japanese settlements in the Edo period, life moved with deliberate slowness. The land provided, but only if it was treated gently. Rice, tea, daikon, bamboo shoots, these were the staples. Most families kept a few hens. Some kept silkworms in attic lofts. One man was known for growing mountain yams, longer than his own arm. And while every village had its patterns, planting, harvest, the New Year rituals, this one had an unusually introspective pace. They didn't celebrate loudly. They did not boast. In fact, even in nearby towns, the villagers had a reputation for quietness so pronounced that traveling monks sometimes stopped there to rest not for alms, but for the silence. It is in this silence that the rain bell practice made the most sense. The chime was not an interruption, but a note in a longer symphony of hush. The sound of wood creaking, the rustle of sandals on stone, the muffled hum of hand looms behind shoshi screens. Even the dogs barked softly, as though out of respect. One visitor, a minor poet from Kanazawa, who passed through in the late 1700s, wrote in a journal, "Here it rains with welcome, not just from sky to field, but from field to sky. Even the wind pauses to listen to the bells." This passage survives only because the poet scribbled it in the margins of a letter he never sent. It was discovered decades later, tucked into the folds of a lacquered box that had been turned into a drawer divider by his grandson. There was no temple at the center of this village. Instead, a modest earthen shrine stood beside an old cedar tree near the edge of the stream. It was dedicated not to a major deity like Amaterasu or Inari, but to a minor kami known locally as Amidor no Kami, the rain guest spirit. The name appears in no official Shinto registry and likely was a hyperlocal embodiment of weather, similar to dozens of small weather kami honored throughout rural Japan. Offerings to the spirit were odd but charming. Scraps of washed linen, tiny clay cups of tea, folded paper frogs. Once a year, during the early summer rains, known as suyu, a few elders would quietly hang bells from the lower cedar branches and whisper short poems to the breeze. These poems, rarely written down, were not meant to be remembered. They were gifts for the rain only. Some historians have speculated that the bell-ringing tradition was a response to the Tenmai famine of the 1780s, a time when drought and failed crops devastated parts of Japan. But the records in this village don't align with that theory. Instead, the bells seem to have served less as a magical tool and more as an emotional anchor, a gentle way to acknowledge uncertainty, to express gratitude for what had not yet arrived. The bells themselves also changed with time. In earlier generations, they were made of wood, producing a dull knock more than a ring. By the mid-1800s, metal versions became more common-shaped, like inverted thimbles or small flower buds tied with thin thread. Children often decorated them with bits of pressed wildflowers or painted faces on them to help the rain feel at home. It's worth pausing here to think about this gesture, decorating a bell to make weather feel welcome. What kind of worldview does that reveal? One possibility is that the people of this village saw themselves not as masters of the land, but as part of a mutual relationship. The rain was not a servant, nor an enemy. It was a traveler, perhaps weary, who needed a soft landing. Bells, in this sense, were not tools, but invitations. We find echoes of this in the way the villagers treated other natural events. For instance, when the first frost came, they did not lament the loss of harvest, but held a brief twilight gathering where neighbors drank warm barley water and placed pine needles on their doorways to remind winter it was expected. During cicada season, children hung small fabric hammocks in trees, claiming the bugs would rest in them between songs. These small customs were rarely recorded because they were never seen as especially noteworthy. But that's precisely what makes them powerful. They were part of a lived, boring, beautiful, routine daily acts of recognition and acceptance. One curious detail emerges from a series of letters written by a traveling merchant named Ito Genji, who visited the region around 1854. In a brief line, he remarks, "There is a valley village where women ring bells when it smells like moss. And they say it helps the rice breathe better. I don't understand this, but it calmed my mules." It's not clear whether Genji understood what he witnessed. His tone is puzzled, but not mocking. And he mentions that he purchased a bell from a child for 2 sen. He tied it to his cart, where it chimed softly for the rest of his journey. There's no mention of whether he kept it by the late 19th century. As rail lines spread and traditional farming communities began to shrink, the village slowly emptied. Some homes were abandoned, and their bells, still hanging, rang faintly during windstorms. A school was built nearby, and later, a paved road. Though few maps ever named the village directly, the last known participant in the aim no kanpai tradition was a woman named Hiroko. Born in 1891, in her 90s, she recounted to a visiting ethnography how, as a child, she would be woken gently by her grandmother before rain. They would walk to the back porch, take the bell from its nail, and ring it once, then wait, then ring again. Not to summon, but to greet, she said. I don't know if the rain came because we rang the bells, but it always felt more welcome when we did. Hiroko's account was recorded on reel-to-reel tape, which now sits in the archives of a university folklore department in Tokyo. You can still hear the hesitation in her voice, the long pauses between memories, the sound of the bell she used. That day, the one she had saved her entire life was recorded to. It was faint, slightly rusted, but unmistakably tender. How did a tiny village come to believe that acknowledging the sky with a sound could matter. Was it superstition? A comfort? Ritual? Or something even quieter in expression of reverence we no longer have words for? Section 3as. The 20th century unfolded across Japan with astonishing speed railways stretching across mountains, telegraph wires humming between cities, and concrete gradually replacing stone. The small traditions of quiet villages were the first to fade. The bell-ringing rain ritual, like so many others, disappeared not with ceremony, but with time. By the 1930s, the last of the rain bell homes had been sold or abandoned. Young villagers had moved to larger towns in search of schooling or factory work. Their children would grow up in a world where rain meant flooded gutters, slippery sidewalks, and delays to commuter trains. Not something to be welcomed, but managed, mitigated, avoided, and yet, not all traces vanished. A local schoolteacher named Mr. Yoshida, who took up post in a new elementary school near the Old Valley site in 1952, began to notice strange objects hanging from trees along the walking paths behind the fields. They looked like makeshift wind chimes, but didn't move with the breeze. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were small bells, old ones, many rusted, some made of carved wood with faded paint. He counted 12 over the course of a single spring. Intrigued, he began asking local elders if they knew what they were. A few remembered the bell-ringing days vaguely. One said, "Ah, yes, when I was very small, my mother used to ring a bell when the air smelled like wet straw." Another recalled, "We used to say hello to the clouds with sound. Then the clouds said hello back." Mr. Yoshida became fascinated. He began a modest research project, speaking to aging villagers, collecting bell fragments, and photographing the trees where they were found. He never published anything academic. He was not a folklorist or historian, but he kept a personal journal filled with pencil drawings, observations, and brief conversations. One page, dated May 12, 1956, reads, "A student today asked why the air feels round before a storm. I did not know how to answer, but I remembered the bells. Perhaps they were the answer." Another page features a sketch of a cracked ceramic bell tied with green string and labeled, "Found near old shrine path." Sounded dull, but kind. By the early 1970s, most of the physical bells had disappeared. Vines grew over garden gates. New homes were built with metal roofs and concrete steps. What little remained of the village became part of a suburban satellite, absorbed by the growing sprawl of outer Niigata. And yet, now and then, someone would find a bell in the dirt while planting a hydrangea bush. Or a child, exploring the woods, would tug on a piece of string poking from a tree and hear the soft clink of old copper. A few families touched by the story, began to craft their own bells not out of belief in the weather spirits, but as a form of quiet nostalgia. In 1983, a local craftswoman named Emiko Hayashi began selling handmade rain bells at her roadside pottery shop. She called them Aim no Okurimono, or rain offerings. They weren't replicas. Exactly, each one was slightly different, shaped by Emiko's own memories and imagination. Some had pressed flowers, others were wrapped in vintage kimono fabric. She included with each bell a small, handwritten card, explaining the old village tradition in a few gentle lines. These bells were once rung to welcome rain, not stop it. They remind us to greet what we cannot control with softness, not fear. Emiko's bells became modestly popular among travelers and school teachers, and even inspired a short children's book in 1997. In the story, a girl hears a bell in the wind and follows it to an old woman who teaches her to listen to the silence between sounds. It was never a bestseller, but it was read aloud in several classrooms on rainy days. Today, the village no longer exists on modern maps. The name, if it ever had an official one, has been lost to bureaucratic restructuring. But the tradition of Aimno Kampai lives on, not in practice, perhaps, but in memory. And sometimes that is enough. Occasionally, an ethnography or amateur historian rediscovers the bell story, often stumbling upon Mr. Yoshida's notes or Hiroko's recorded interview from the university archive. They write articles with titles like Sound and Silence in Edo Era, whether rituals or echoes of rain, reconstructing rural spiritual practices in 19th century Japan. These pieces are thoughtful, detailed, respectful, but they cannot quite capture the feel of standing barefoot on a wooden porch, holding a bell in one hand and waiting for the sky to answer. And yet, perhaps that's the point. So much of history lives in the small, unremarkable spaces, in the way a grandmother tilts her head to read the clouds, or how a child ties a ribbon around a clay bell just because it makes her feel peaceful. These moments don't make it into textbooks, but they shape how people lived and how they met the world each day. To ring a bell not out of fear or demand, but in welcomeism, that a kind of philosophy, a worldview crafted from patience, humility, and the quiet belief that nature, like people, responds better to kindness than command. So what if the rain didn't come every time? So what if the practice faded? The point was never control. The point was connection. Perhaps we might ask ourselves, what modern rituals have we lost because they weren't loud enough to survive? What parts of our lives could be gentled by a bell, a pause, and a quiet hello to the weather? Story 2. How Korean scholars packed folding desks and tea sets for forest walks. Section 1. In the quiet forests of Hosainira, Korea, there once walked a particular kind of figure, not a monk, nor a soldier, nor even a wandering merchant, but a scholar, a Confucian scholar, to be precise, dressed in pale robes that swayed softly with each step, wearing a wide-brimmed horsehair hat, and carrying a bundle that looked less like luggage and more like a picnic. These men were part of a unique scholarly tradition that blurred the lines between study, ritual, and nature. They were known as CNB gentlemen of letters and moral integrity. And among their many unusual customs, one stands out as especially boring, beautifully slow, and oddly moving. They packed folding desks and tiny tea sets to take with them on long, solitary walks into the forest, not for leisure, but for thinking. It is tempting to imagine them as hermits or poets, but CNB were neither reclusive nor entirely romantic. They were deeply engaged with society, or at least the idea of it. Many had once held world refuse government positions, local schools. Others lived in self-imposed exile, refusing to serve corrupt rulers, preferring the company of pine trees and streams to that of palace courtiers. The Joseon dynasty, which ruled Korea from the late 14th century to the end of the 19th, prized Neo-Confucian values, scholarship, moral cultivation, and a life of moderation. Within this framework, the CNB emerged not as official policy, but as a cultural ideal. They were supposed to live simply, read constantly, speak carefully, and remain unimpressed by wealth or power. And so, many of them developed a habit that seems both absurdly impractical and deeply poetic. Taking their entire workspace, including low wooden desks, inkstones, calligraphy, brushes, and even porcelain teacups, sends to the woods. One such scholar, Yi Huang, 1501 to 1570, whose pen name was Togai, is perhaps the most famous. He lived near the scenic valley of Dosan in a modest retreat known as Dosan Siwon. There, he wrote philosophical treatises, poetry, and letters, while sitting beneath a persimmon tree, sipping quietly brewed green tea. But Yi Wang was not alone in this practice. Across the peninsula, many CNB adopted a kind of mobile study culture. They designed folding desks made of lightweight pine or bamboo, sometimes lacquered, sometimes not. These desks were not much larger than a modern laptop tray and could be quickly unfolded and placed on a rock, a tree stump, or the forest floor. Alongside these desks, they packed ink and brush, paper scrolls, and often a tiny tea set, no more than 2 or 3 pieces. Tea, for them, was not a luxury or even a drink of refreshment. It was a moral pause. Brewing it was a moment to reset one's thoughts. Drinking it was a way to bring the outside world into harmony with one's inner mind. These study walks could last several hours, sometimes entire days. Scholars would leave at dawn, walking slowly along winding mountain paths, stopping to jot down thoughts about ethics, nature, or governance. Some wrote about ants or the angle of sunlight. Others reflected on what it meant to live honorably under a corrupt king. There are even records sparse and quiet as footnotes, so Seonbi, who became attached to certain trees, returning to the same one every week, calling it their study companion. One scholar referred to a particular boulder as his second teacher. Another named a stream the river of quiet correction. Their writings were full of these gentle metaphors. In one preserved letter, dated 1632, a scholar named Kim Sung-jin wrote to a friend, "I returned to the pine grove near Gosen Hill. The wind there whispers more clearly than the arguments of men. My folding desk wobbled slightly, but it reminded me to be humble." We might imagine that these scholars were attempting to escape the world, but that would be a misreading. Their retreat into nature was not about avoidance. It was about refinement. The forest was not an escape. It was a tuning fork. Many Seonbi scholars believed that being in nature helped cleanse the mind of distraction and selfish impulse, not to feel relaxed necessarily, but to reorient one's thoughts toward virtue and clarity. Their slow walks were structured like essays, with an introduction, a development of thought, a revision through scenery, and a quiet conclusion scribbled. Just before sunset, a folding desk might seem a strange thing to carry over a mountain path, but it symbolized something greater. That thought, like water, must move and be placed in natural surroundings to stay pure. The scholar in the forest wasn't performing a ritual. He was continuing his life of inquiry just outdoors. Interestingly, these journeys were rarely discussed in public. There was no performance in them, no competition. They were private acts of discipline. A scholar might spend weeks preparing a trip, but never mention it in polite conversation. It was seen not as a story worth telling, but as an act of cultivation. No, different than boiling rice or mending a robe. That's what makes it so boring and so beautiful. There were practical challenges, of course. Rain, bugs, ink freezing in colder seasons, the occasional curious bear. But these were endured quietly, noted in the margins of journals as small inconveniences rather than obstacles. One scholar wrote, "The mosquito bites only where the thought has not been resolved." That line, found in a battered notebook preserved. In a provincial archive, tells us a lot about the Xiangbi spirit. Everything was part of the process 7: distraction, discomfort, and imperfection. So why carry all this into the forest? Why not simply walk and think? What did it mean to these scholars to set up a tiny desk under a tree and write things no one might ever read? Section 2. If Section 1 introduced you to the quiet, deliberate world of Korea's Xiangbi scholars and their portable study rituals, then this section will take you deeper into the meanings and rhythms behind those forest walks, the social expectations, the Confucian logic, and the tiny details that made this strange practice not only acceptable, but admirable in its time. You may wonder how a scholar's folding desk in the woods came to represent the peak of virtue. To understand that, we need to step sideways into Confucian philosophy, particularly the Neo-Confucian framework that shaped Joseon society from top to bottom. In this world, to study was to live. Learning wasn't a means to success. It was success. And the more humble and repetitive the process, the more virtuous it was considered. In fact, memorizing books was not even the end goal. What mattered was self-cultivation, the endless process of refining one's inner character to become a model for others. This wasn't for fame. This was so society itself could remain stable and good. And the first step toward that kind of self-mastery, solitude, reflection, bored repetition, that's where the folding desk comes in. Most Xiangbi lived modestly. They didn't own much, and many refused to seek office, despite passing the demanding civil service exams. A man could study for decades and then politely turn down the king's invitation to serve, citing personal integrity or political protest. These refusals were not dramatic. They were quiet. A short letter, a return to the countryside, perhaps a new folding desk, and there were many kinds of these desks. In some cases, the desks were carved from gnarled pine or mulberry wood, carefully shaped to rest evenly on uneven earth. Others were assembled with wooden pegs, no nails, and could be collapsed flat like a book. Some had drawers for brushes, others slots for rolled scrolls. But all had to be small enough to carry either by hand or slung over the back with twine. Tea was no less important. A scholar might carry a small gourd of water, a packet of green tea leaves wrapped in paper, a thin brass pot, and 1 or 2 porcelain cups, softened, mismatched. Brewing tea was part of a ritual that brought rhythm to the day. Scholars believed the act of preparing tea slowed the mind and cleared muddled thinking. Just as ink must be ground slowly on a stone, thought must be brewed. Tea, like writing, was an act of attention. These details were not ornamental. They were ethical. To brew tea in a careless way or scribble without order was to practice disorder. And disorder, in the Confucian worldview, meant moral decay, not just in the individual, but in society as a whole. That's why even an hour in the forest had to be composed, balanced, and quietly purposeful. Scholars often began their day with a formal bow to their books or their teachers, living or dead. Then they would walk slowly in the rhythm of breath. The goal was not to reach a place, but to find a mental posture. Once the right tree or stone presented itself, usually chosen by intuition, not habit, they would set down their desk, unfold it carefully, place the inkstone in the center, and pour a small cup of tea. Only then would they begin to write. But what did they write? Sometimes philosophical essays. At other times, responses to earlier scholars, perhaps to Zhu Xi, the great Chinese Neo-Confucian whose teachings shaped Joseon Korea. But often, the writing was deeply personal, private, and meditative. A page might begin with an observation about the angle of sunlight, shift into reflections on a king's moral failings, and end with a confession about the writer's impatience with his neighbors. And all of it would be written in a calm, ordered script, calligraphy itself being a moral exercise. These forest sessions were not meant to produce great works, but to keep the self aligned. One scholar, Yun Xiando, 1587 to 1671, wrote in a letter, "When the ink runs dry before the thought has reached its end, I consider it a lesson. The mind must not outpace the body." This line captures the deliberate slowness that Xian Bi prized. Nothing was to be rushed. Even failure was folded into the process, treated as instruction. And yet, for all this solemnity, these walks were not entirely without comfort or subtle pleasure. Some scholars developed routines, visiting the same mossy stone each week, feeding a particular bird, or noticing the first seasonal buds on a cherry tree. They rarely described these things as beautiful. Instead, they called them correct. The forest, in its natural order, reminded them how humans should live modestly, harmoniously, and without excess. It's important to remember that Joseon Korea was not an easy place to live. Political purges were common, and Confucian scholars were often caught in court intrigues. A poorly timed essay could lead to exile, or worse. Many CNB who refused to compromise ended up living in remote villages, writing not for an audience, but for posterity, for themselves. Their walks into the woods were, in many ways, their answer to chaos, not protest, not rebellion, but a quiet commitment to a moral rhythm. This rhythm was embedded in everything: the click of the wooden desk, hinges, the rustle of scrolls, the slow circle of tea inside a porcelain cup. Even the posture of sitting on the ground legs folded, back upright, was part of it. One record from a scholar named Wang Jini mentions how he carried a silk cloth to place under his desk, not to stay clean, but to honor the act of study. Even outdoors, it's easy to romanticize this, but for the CMB, it wasn't romantic. It was duty, even if no one saw them, even if the ink faded, even if the scrolls were lost. They believed that virtue, once practiced, changed the world. Even a single page, written in silence under a tree. But what happened when the scholar returned from the forest? Did his thoughts carry back into the home, the classroom, or the village council? Or did those hours of walking and tea drinking vanish like mist? Section 3. We return now to the end of the forest walk, the slow winding path back home. The folding desk slung under one arm, the tea vessel emptied and gently rinsed in a stream. The ink dried. For the Korean scholar, the walk was never just a morning outing. It was a preparation for life back in society. Because the truth was, CMB did not live alone. After all that walking, riding, and tea drinking under trees, the scholar would re-enter a world of expectations. There were elders to greet, students to teach, neighbors to advise, sometimes even kings to counsel. The forest might have offered solitude, but the village was always waiting. The scholar's home was usually modest, often a wooden hanak house with a raised floor, paper windows, and a courtyard garden. Books lined the walls, not in glass cases or shelves, but bundled and stacked neatly in cloth-wrapped scrolls or hand-stitched volumes. The most treasured books were those copied by hand line by line over months or years, in brush and ink here. The scholar would resume his daily routine. Wake before dawn, bow to the ancestors, brew tea, read aloud in a steady voice, not for others, but so the body could feel the shape of wisdom. Teach any students who came, sometimes children from the village, other times curious travelers or wandering monks. They were taught not just reading and writing, but how to sit, how to breathe, how to think. Everything mattered. And yet, everything also moved slowly. If a student asked a question, the scholar might pause for several minutes before answering, not because he didn't know, but because answering too quickly could be a sign of arrogance. The pause itself was part of the lesson. Outside the home, the scholar served as a quiet presence in village life. He might write letters for the illiterate. He might mediate disputes not with strong opinions, but with references to ancient texts. And if there was illness or drought, he might consult the I Ching or observe seasonal signs, not to claim supernatural power, but to search for moral alignment between heaven and earth. This was a world where action followed thought and thought followed principle, and yet the scholar was not always praised. In fact, many were misunderstood to the impatient official. The scholar seemed lazy to the ambitious merchant. He seemed unworldly to the local gossip. He seemed aloof, quiet to a fault. But among those who understood, the scholar represented something rare, an anchor, a living reminder that even in uncertain times, one could live by principle 11 if it meant folding a desk, walking into the woods and returning without applause. You might think such men were few, but in fact, the C&B class was extensive. Not all were saints, not all were wise, but many were sincere. They lived in a web of mutual expectations where even silence could speak volumes. There are preserved letters, now yellowed and fading, that capture the tone of this life. One from the scholar Joe Seek, 1501 to 1572, reads, "I have walked the river path every morning for 12 years, and still I do not understand the water. But I have come to understand my impatience. This is enough for now." Another scholar wrote in a rain-stained journal, "I carried my desk to the hill today. The clouds were low, and the trees had little to say. But the tea was warm, and I remembered a line from Mengzi, 'The heart must rest before it can listen.'" These were not dramatic realizations. There were no revolutions, no arrests, no proclamations, just a daily practice, just a desk, a cup, a page. Yet the influence of these quiet scholars lasted centuries. They shaped the tone of Korean ethics, education, and politics even when they refused power. Their essays are still taught. Their calligraphy is still studied. Their rituals, slow tea, deep reading, forest solitude, have returned in modern Korea in new forms. Wellness retreats, calligraphy clubs, tea, meditation sessions. There are even scholars today who, in tribute, walk into the woods with a folding table and a notebook, not to reenact the past, but to remember that thought takes time, and that silence is not the absence of wisdom, but sometimes its source. Of course, not every scholar was serene. There were petty rivalries, harsh winters, spilled ink, bad tea. The important thing was to keep going, to fold the desk again the next day and walk toward a quiet place. In many ways, that folding desk became a symbol not of escape, but of return. The scholar didn't flee society. He stepped away so he could return better, and perhaps even now. In a noisy world filled with speed and updates and constant urgency, the idea still matters. that a small, simple act like brewing tea with intention or copying a sentence slowly might still carry meaning. That virtue is not found in loud declarations, but in the quiet rhythm of daily practice. So the next time you hear of someone walking alone with a strange wooden desk on their back, or brewing tea under a tree for no one in particular, maybe it's not eccentricity, maybe it's a very old, very deliberate kind of wisdom. Story 3. Boring Greek myths for sleep. Why Poseidon got jealous of a horse and built a salt fountain. Section 1. Before the thunder of Zeus, before the cunning of Odysseus, before even the golden apples or Helen of Troy, there was a horse. Not just any horse, a very good one by most ancient accounts. Strong-legged, swift, and shimmering with divine presence. But this isn't a story about the horse, exactly. It's a story about someone who didn't like that horse quite so much. That someone was Poseidon. Yes, that Poseidon god of the sea, shaker of the earth, brother of Zeus, beard wet with sea foam and hair tangled in kelp. But at this moment, in our boring little myth, Poseidon was not shaking the earth. He wasn't even at sea. He was standing on a rocky hillside, looking annoyed. The location, a little-known corner of Attica, not far from Athens. The situation, a city had no patron god, and the people needed one. You see, in the early days of the Greek world, according to the old dusty scrolls, the gods still auditioned for cities. They weren't yet set in their domains. There were contests, debates, offerings, and in this case, both Athena and Poseidon were vying for the same prize, to be the patron deity of this modest city. Now, one might think this would involve dramatic speeches or battles of strength, but no, it came down to a gift. The people would choose whichever god gave them the most useful offering. Practicality mattered more than power. Poseidon went first, and he did something rather dramatic, at least for ancient standards. He lifted his trident, struck the rocky ground, and, with a thunderous crack, a fountain burst forth. Not a babbling brook, not a soft spring. No, it was a roaring saltwater geyser that gushed high into the air before settling into a steaming, churning pool. The people gasped. A spring from stone, a miracle. Poseidon crossed his arms, satisfied. Then Athena stepped forward. She said nothing. She simply knelt in the dirt, pressed her hand to the soil, and after a moment, a small, thin tree began to rise. Its bark was grayish and rough. Its leaves were pale green and soft. And, after a pause, tiny olives began to form on the branches. Horus watched all this from the hillside. It was, by most accounts, Poseidon's own creation. He had invented horses, you see, long ago, perhaps as an experiment in strength and speed. Some myths even say he made the first one while trying to impress Demeter, which didn't quite work. But he liked the result and kept it. Anyway, that horse seemed unimpressed by the salt fountain. It flicked its tail, wandered over to the olive tree, nibbled one of the branches, and then, according to a few forgotten storytellers, actually sat down in the shade of Athena's tree. Poseidon looked at the horse. The horse did not look back. Now, here's where things get rather dull in a delightful way. A powerful saltwater spring that showed divine might, or a quiet tree that gave fruit, oil, wood, and shade. They chose the olive tree. Athena became the goddess of the city, and Poseidon, whose salt fountain still boiled away at the edge of the hill, was left standing there, not furious, not weeping, just irritated. And that's where we begin, because it wasn't the loss that stung most, it was the fact that his own creation, the horse, seemed more taken with Athena's gift. Over the centuries, Greek poets spun grand tales of Poseidon's rage, storms and floods, punishments and revenge. But there are older, more obscure account stuck into the scroll margins, passed down by half-sleeping scribes, that describe something else entirely. Poseidon built a series of salt fountains across the land, not to punish, not to threaten, but to compete, to impress, to quietly want that horse. These fountains weren't majestic. In fact, they were often quite underwhelming. A dribble here, a bubbling pool there, always salty, sometimes warm, sometimes just a crusty patch of minerals on a rock. Locals thought they were natural, but if you looked closely, they always had a small trident carved near, barely visible, as though Poseidon didn't want to make too much of it. One such fountain was found on the island of De La Salti, shallow and smelling faintly of fish. Another in a cave in Thessaly, where it merely left white crystals on the cave walls. Yet another outside Corinth, where children used it to preserve anchovies. They called them Poseidon's tears, or seas, navel, or horse spring. No one quite knew why they were there, but they remained. And the horse, well, it didn't seem to care. It was just a horse, which made Poseidon even more invested now. We might pause here and wonder, why would a powerful god spend centuries making fountains to impress a creature he invented? Perhaps it was never about the horse at all. Perhaps the horse represented something else, a sense of admiration Poseidon rarely received, a simple nod of approval that never came. The salt fountains were his way of saying, "Look what I can do, not to mortals, not even to Athena, but to himself, to his own need for acknowledgement. And yet, there's something oddly comforting in this, that even God's mighty, ancient, ocean-soaked gods could feel petty, unnoticed, mildly jealous, that they, too, made quiet offerings in forgotten corners of the world. Hoping someone might notice, in the next section, we'll follow Poseidon as he visits one of his salt fountains hundreds of years later, alone, unrecognized, and still quietly competitive with a horse who remains entirely unaware. Section 2 centuries had passed. Civilizations rose and fell. Philosophers had argued about atoms, stars, and whether a man could know anything at all. But deep in the hills of Boeotia, there was still a little salt fountain, bubbling quietly in the shade of some olive trees. The spring didn't make much noise. In fact, most travelers overlooked it entirely. The water didn't rise more than a few inches. It wasn't useful for drinking. It left a crust of white on nearby rocks. A few sleepy frogs sometimes sat near it in the summer. It smelled faintly of old fish. But then, one late afternoon on a day with no historical significance whatsoever, Poseidon returned to that little spring dot, not in a storm cloud, not astride his chariot of seahorses. He just peered, alone. He stood at the edge of the fountain, arms folded, looking down into the murky water. A single dragonfly buzzed lazily nearby. No one noticed him. No thunder cracked. Mortals fled. It was not a moment for poetry, and still, he stood there for quite a while. Now, if we are to believe the more obscure scrolls, especially those copied by temple assistants with poor handwriting, Poseidon had visited this spot many times before, quietly, privately, as if checking whether the fountain had grown more impressive. It hadn't. There were faint, trident carvings on a stone nearby, worn down to near invisibility. The sort of marks a god might make without wanting to admit he made them. Poseidon crouched beside the spring. He dipped his fingers into it. The water was cold. Not cold like a winter wave, but cold in a lazy way. The way a puddle is cold in the early morning. He muttered something. A few bubbles rose. The god stared into them. This is not the kind of scene one usually imagines for a deity of Poseidon's stature. But this is boring history. And even gods have boring afternoons. Far away, in a dry paddock near an abandoned shrine, a horse sneezed. It was old, not immortal, not divine. Just a very, very old horse. Some said it was descended from the original horse Poseidon had shaped long ago. Others said it had just wandered in one day and never left. It spent most of its time under an olive tree. Sometimes it stared at the horizon, as if waiting for something. Other times, it dozed. No one paid much attention to it, and it seemed to prefer that Dot, the villagers nearby, mostly olive farmers, left offerings to Athena at the shrine. Bread, figs, bits of polished shell. They never prayed to Poseidon. They didn't even remember the salt fountain in the hills. Poseidon remembered. Back at the spring, he was now reclining on a flat rock, not throne-like, just sitting in a rather slouched, mortal posture. Seaweed twined faintly around his wrist. He was talking softly to himself, or to the fountain, or possibly to the horse, though it was many hills away. She made a tree, he said, plucking a salt crust from the water's edge. That's all, just a tree. Silence. He looked up at the sky. The clouds drifted, indifferent. A clever tree, he admitted, but still, a tree. Made waves, earthquakes, horses. This, he motioned to the fountain. This should have meant something. The spring gurgled in a way that was not entirely sympathetic. Poseidon reached into the water again. This time, he pulled out a handful of soggy leaves. They were not special. They were just wet leaves. He dropped them with a sigh. A passing shepherd might have caught a glimpse of him and assumed he was just a fisherman, lost and grumbling to himself. And yet, Poseidon wasn't angry. That's important to note. He wasn't plotting revenge. He wasn't raising a wave or conjuring a kraken. He was simply sitting beside a forgotten work, wondering if it ever mattered. Have you ever created something, left it alone for years, then returned only to find it duller than you remembered? Gods to experience that feeling. Meanwhile, the old horse was eating a rather unripe olive. It winced slightly, but kept chewing. From time to time, the villagers would talk about selling the old shrine land to make room for more groves. But the horse always returned. No matter where they moved it, it came back and stood beneath that tree. Some believed it was a sign from Athena. Others simply found the horse inconvenient. Poseidon knew better. He could feel the subtle tug of creation, how the shape of that animal still echoed with his divine fingerprints, even after generations. Even after forgetting, the horse didn't know. It blinked, then scratched itself on the tree. Back at the spring, Poseidon leaned down and whispered something into the water. The surface shimmered faintly. Then, with a wave of his hand, he deepened the basin by a few inches, just enough to make it seem intentional. He also added a small ripple, gentle, rhythmic, like the breathing of something asleep. And then he stood. "Fine," he said aloud. "Maybe the olive tree gives oil, but salt preserves. Salt keeps things. He paused. Salt endures. It wasn't a great line, not something a bard would sing, but it mattered to him. Before leaving, he carved a new trident, just a small one on a nearby rock, right next to the old one. He made sure it was a little neater this time, more balanced than he vanished. Not in a flash of sea mist or thunder, just vanished. That spring is still there, they say. A little deeper now, slightly clearer. Some hikers mistake it for a natural mineral pool. Others avoid it because of the smell. But if you sit beside it long enough, in the late afternoon, you might feel the sense of someone having just left. Like the seat beside you was warm a moment ago. Like something powerful and oddly insecure had once been here. And on the far hill, under the olive tree, the horse still naps. In the next and final section, we'll follow the story to a forgotten temple archive, where a dusty scroll reveals what Poseidon really intended all along, and how the quiet competition between salt and olives continued in unexpected ways across the centuries. Section 3. Long after Poseidon's quiet visit to the salt spring, long after the olive groves spread, the shrines crumbled, and the horse finally wandered off into some unknown corner of mythology, there remained a modest temple, archive just a few valleys away. It was not a grand archive, certainly not like those in Delphi or Alexandria. It had no marble columns, no golden statues, no priest scribes with ivory ink pots. This archive was mostly one room, stone walls, a leaky roof, shelves full of scrolls that had not been read in generations. A lonely owl occasionally roosted in the rafters, and yet, buried somewhere on the second shelf from the bottom, behind a moldy account of wheat deliveries and a hymn to a minor river god, was a scroll titled "The Contest of Salt and Olive," an unedited account. The handwriting was terrible, but it told a different version of the famous myth. In this version, mostly dismissed by serious scholars, Athena's olive tree had indeed impressed the gods, but it had also immediately attracted dozens of squirrels, beetles, and one very aggressive goat. Meanwhile, Poseidon's fountain, though briny and impractical, had been the subject of quiet fascination, not awe, not admiration, fascination. According to the scroll, it wasn't the salt water that made the gods pause. It was what happened when someone drank it by accident and couldn't stop sneezing for 3 days. Apollo allegedly laughed so hard he dropped his lyre. Hera disapproved, but secretly asked Poseidon how he had done it. Only Athena stayed composed, simply placing her olive branch in the soil with a calm nod, as if she had not noticed the sneezing priest in the background. The vote had been unanimous, of course. The city became Athens. The olive became sacred. The salt fountain was forgotten, but in the margins of the scroll, someone had scribbled a note. Poseidon returned to the spring, carved again, the third mark deeper than the first two. He muttered something about preservation and stubbornness, left a fish. Nobody noticed. Whoever wrote it had poor grammar and less poetic sense. Still, it was the only written reference to Poseidon's later visits. The fish was never found. Centuries passed. The salt spring, by then just a minor mineral feature on a poorly drawn map, was visited by monks, shepherds, hikers, and briefly German geologists who declared it chemically unremarkable. But each time someone tried to fill in the spring or divert its water, something went mildly wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Just ... inconvenient ... tools went missing. Maps tore. One cartographer reported that every time he drew over the spring, on his parchment, the ink would blur for no reason. He gave up and went back to drawing goat paths. Even the olive grove on the hill above it began producing smaller fruit whenever someone spoke poorly of salt in its shade. Coincidence? Most likely, but the villagers, a traveling antiquarian from Naples, an overly enthusiastic man named Stefano, happened upon the spring while looking for Byzantine ruins. He drank from it immediately, spat it out, declared it completely undrinkable, then paused. He looked closer. The water shimmered oddly in the sunlight. He scribbled some notes. A salty spring, oddly persistent. Perhaps a cultic remnant. No sign of altar, but faint carvings nearby. Tri-pronged symbol, Poseidon. Unusual for this region. He returned. The next year with a small crew, intending to excavate. But the mule carrying his tools got spooked by an owl and ran off. They gave up. His journal entry that night. The spring remains. A useless thing, yet oddly insistent. A monument to divine stubbornness, perhaps. He sketched the fountain. 3 lines nearby the tridents. And then, of course, there was the weather incident in 1933 during an unusually dry summer. A few local farmers gathered near the spring, not for worship, not for ritual, just to sit in the shade. Someone mentioned how the olive trees were struggling. Another remarked half as a joke that perhaps they should have picked salt instead. Within the hour, a gentle rain fell, not heavy, not dramatic, just a soft, steady drizzle, enough to wet the soil and cool the air. The farmers went home quietly. The next week, someone left a small fish on a flat stone by the spring today. If you were to visit the hills outside ancient Athens, you might still find it, a shallow basin, white crust at the edges, the faint gurgle of salt water that goes nowhere. Some local maps don't even mark it, but hikers sometimes leave coins there, or bread, or the occasional seashell. No one is quite sure why. There's a worn stone beside Etit's carvings, nearly gone, but if the light hits it just right, you might still see 3 faint marks, trident-shaped, in a line, and just beside them, carved lower and smaller than the rest, the outline of a horse. So why did Poseidon make the salt fountain? To it again and again. Maybe it wasn't jealousy. Maybe it wasn't about the contest at all. Maybe it was about having made something quietly, stubbornly, and watching it remain when all the songs and statues were gone. Because salt doesn't dazzle. Salt doesn't bloom, but salt stays. Story 4. Boring history for sleep. How Byzantine grandmothers made soup to predict the weather section. 1. You're in a small stone kitchen. The walls are thick, built not for luxury, but for insulation. The air smells faintly of onion, rosemary, and something else, something ancient and tangy, like a broth that's been simmering for days. Outside, it's early morning in the Byzantine countryside. The air is still. The fog hangs low. Nothing dramatic is happening. A grandmother, her name is probably Maria. Though no one agrees, for certain lifts the lid of a clay pot, leans in and squints. She doesn't taste the soup. That's not the point. She's watching how the steam curls. If it rises straight, tomorrow will be cold and clear. If it drifts and clings to the window, rain is coming. That, at least, is what she tells the neighbor's son, who has already decided. This is nonsense. She disagrees. The soup always knows, in the grand stories of Byzantium, the epic battles, the shifting empires, the theological councils that lasted weeks, you won't find much mention of weather soup. No historian wrote it down. No emperor consulted it. But in kitchens across the empire, especially in the provinces, places like Cappadocia, the Peloponnese, and Thrace, there were women who watched broth like scholars watched the stars. It was a quiet kind of wisdom, passed from mother to daughter, or in some cases, 2 sons too bored or too polite to leave the kitchen. It wasn't just about steam. There were dozens of signs, all subtle. If lentils float before the boil, expect wind. If the garlic browns too quickly in oil, a dry heat is coming. If a bay leaf curls toward the spoon, a visitor will arrive. These rules weren't written. They were lived, and they weren't always right. Sometimes the lentils floated because the pot was too full. Sometimes the garlic browned because the firewood was too dry. But still, the old women persisted. They stirred clockwise on cold days, counterclockwise. On humid ones, they insisted that soup could sense things. And in a way, it could. In the Byzantine world, official forecasting was reserved for monks, mathematicians, and astrologers. In Constantinople, the imperial city, scholars studied eclipses and lunar patterns. They compiled calendars predicting floods and famines. Some even claimed to foresee political unrest based on sunspots, but none of them ever asked the grandmothers about their soup, which is a shame, because while court astrologers were debating the meaning of goat entrails, a grandmother in a mountain village was quietly noting that the broth had turned cloudy an hour earlier than usual. And sure enough, by morning, her donkey refused to leave the shed. Rain followed that afternoon. Coincidence? Maybe, but the donkey never lied. Some scholars today dismiss all of this as folklore. They call it culinary superstition, lumping it in with things like garlic charms and the belief that whistling at night invites trouble. But if you dig into local village records, especially those maintained by monasteries, you start to see patterns. There are brief mentions in the margins. Old woman refused to bake bread, said the broth smelled of storms. Storm followed. Monk's diary. Thessaly, 1104 CE. Peasant wife refused to send son to market. Claimed soup turned sour without lemon. Hail that evening. Abbey notes, Cappadocia, 987 CE. These are not the records of scientists, but they are records of survival. And in the Byzantine countryside, survival mattered more than logic. The actual science behind it, you strip away the charm and superstition isn't that far-fetched. Soup, like all hot liquids, responds to air pressure. A shift in humidity can change the way steam moves, the temperature of the fire, the moisture in the wood, even the way onions release water into the broth. All of it can reflect small changes in the atmosphere. The grandmothers didn't know the physics. They didn't use the word barometric, but they paid attention. A bubbling pot was not just lunch. It was a signal, and they learned to read it. There's one village in particular, now long absorbed into modern Turkey, that had an unusually large number of soup-watchers. The village was called Petrolova. It sat near a bend in a dry riverbed, surrounded by craggy hills and olive trees so old that even the monks gave up counting their rings. Here, the tradition was formalized in a way rarely seen elsewhere. Each spring, before planting season, a group of elder women would gather in the communal kitchen. They brought vegetables, herbs, bones, from the winter stores. Together, they would brew a single large pot of soup. They would sit, watch, sniff, note the curls of steam. They called it the annual broth council. No one took it lightly. If the soup rolled too quickly to the left, beans were to be planted late. If the carrots took longer than usual to soften, expect frost before harvest. No one outside the village believed them. But year after year, Petrolova's planting calendar proved oddly reliable. Of course, not everyone trusted the grandmothers. There was always at least one skeptical uncle, one too clever nephew. They joke about witch broth or forecasting stew. But when their crops failed and the grandmother's fields thrived, they'd quietly ask for advice the following year. And the grandmothers, who never gloated, would hand over a spoon and say, "Watch the garlic. It will tell you more than I can." Perhaps the strangest part of the tradition was its lack of ambition. No one ever tried to publish it. No one built a shrine to the soup pot. It wasn't about magic or reputation. It was about paying attention to heat, to scent, to the way a bay leaf floated when the wind changed outside. It was small, boring, domestic, but in the quiet of a Byzantine village, where survival depended on planting at the right time and bringing the animals in before the hail. Those small observations mattered. So the next time you make suppan, a quiet day, when the wind shifts and the windows rattle, take a moment. Watch the steam dot. Note how it curls, how it drifts, whether it clings to the glass. Somewhere long ago, a Byzantine grandmother did the same. And maybe maybe she saved her village from a storm. Section 2. By the time you reach the second bowl of soup, you begin to notice things you missed the first time. A subtle bitterness beneath the garlic. A shift in the texture of the carrots. The way the parsley clings to the surface instead of sinking politely to the bottom. This, according to Byzantine grandmother logic, is when the soup starts talking back, and the second bowl is always more honest than the first. Let's return for a moment to the village of Petrolova, where the annual broth council met each spring. After the first taste, the grandmothers rarely spoke. They'd stare into the broth, quiet as monks. A fire popped in the corner. A chicken clucked 2 courtyards away. Then, after a long pause, someone might say, "There's too much salt. The river will run high." Or, "The fat hasn't separated. A lean summer's coming." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even metaphor. It was observation, layered over decades of routine. These women had stirred the same soup for 30, 40, even 50 years. They knew how it should look on a normal day. So when something felt different, when the onions sweated more, when the lentils resisted softening, it meant something was out of balance. Not just in the kitchen, in the fields, the skies. The year ahead, the tradition had a strange kind of hierarchy. There was no elected leader, no badge of authority, but every village had one woman whose soup was never wrong in Petrolova. That woman was Yelena of the quiet house. They called her that because she never raised her voice, never knocked on a door, and never left the village knot. Once thought she had the softest hands and the sharpest nose, and she could tell you the week's humidity from a single whiff of celery. Yelena didn't consider herself gifted. She simply paid attention. She claimed she once noticed the climate was changing slightly, subtly, when her marrow bones began to cloud faster than usual. Another year. She warned the village to delay their barley planting because the rosemary kept curling during storage. The monks scoffed. The crops failed. Yelena said nothing. The next year, even the skeptical brothers asked her when to sow their cabbage. This strange art of broth divination had its regional variations. In the coastal provinces, the soup tended to ward fish. Women there believed that if the scales lifted clean from the skin, a storm was near. In the mountain villages, goat meat was the base. If it released fat too quickly in the pot, snow was expected before week's end. And in the plains around Thessalonica, lentil stew was favored. Bubbles that formed in concentric circles. That meant to dry weeks, followed by 3 of wind. No one taught these signs. They were inherited, slowly, like the way a melody passes through generations, or the way a garden remembers where last year's basil grew best. Of course, there were doubters. Some tried to measure the broth in 1162. A monk named Andronikos the Sincere attempted to quantify the soup's predictive power. He created a chart listing broth outcomes versus weather conditions. He even developed a primitive method of weighing steam. The results were inconsistent. The broth cooperated one season, then ignored him completely the next. Frustrated, he gave up, scribbled divine whimsy in the margin of his parchment, and went back to copying scripture. What the monk missed, what all outsiders missed, was that the soup was never meant to be analyzed. It was meant to be lived with. It required patience, quiet, an ear tuned to the everyday rhythms of a village where nothing moved quickly, except maybe the gossip. In fact, many grandmothers believed that talking too much near the soup ruined the reading. Laughter was fine. Singing encouraged. But debate, argument, impatience, that spoiled the broth's signals. If someone interrupted, the whole pot might be discarded. The soup listens, they'd say. Don't give it a reason to lie. Despite its humble origins, the tradition of weather-predicting soup found its way into unexpected places. A record from the island of Lesbos, dated 1203, describes a visiting noblewoman who stayed with a farming family during Lent. After 3 days, she wrote to her sister, "The lady of the house believes her lentils can sense the tide. I find this absurd, yet every day the tide follows her pot." She later added, "I asked her how she knows. She said, the soup spoke through the spoon. I do not understand her." Nor did the noblewoman ever try. She returned to her estate. Her vineyards failed that year. The village she stayed in had one of its most successful harvests in a decade. There's something almost meditative about the way these women approached the broth. They didn't taste it until after the prediction was made. They didn't add salt until the steam had spoken. They stirred slowly, always with a wooden spoon. Never meddle and watch the pot with the reverence usually reserved for saints or relics. Some claim they could even detect bad omens in the way a broth foamed. A gentle foam meant clarity ahead, a violent one. Best to stay home, cancel plans, and double insulate the roof. And though we laugh at it now, the most fascinating aspect is how the tradition resisted writing no manuals, number, recipes. Every granddaughter had to learn by standing quietly beside the stove. There were no shortcuts, no mnemonics, no instruction scrolls, just silence, repetition, and watching. It's said that if a child asked too many questions, the grandmothers would hand them a carrot and say, "Peel this first. You'll understand more when you've peeled 10. It wasn't condescension, it was method, one that demanded time and boredom, and long afternoons where the most important thing happening was whether the parsley wilted too fast as modernity crept in first through trade. Then technology, the tradition, began to fade. Metal pots replaced clay ones. Gas replaced firewood. You couldn't smell humidity over the whir of a stovetop fan. You couldn't read steam in a pressure cooker. But in some corners, especially among families that still remember how to live slowly, the soup still speaks, not to predict wars or plagues or great upheavals, just to say, it will rain soon, plant late this year, take the washing off the line before nightfall. Small things, but in the grand scheme of survival, small things matter. And so, as you stir your own broth, even if it's from a modern kitchen with electric lights and a stainless steel ladle, you might still notice something odd. The way it simmers differently on a humid day. The way it smells just before thunder. The way somehow it knows when you need comfort before you do. The Byzantine grandmothers would say, "That's no accident." They'd say, "The soup always knows." but only if you let it speak first. Section 3 tone, calm, dreamy, gently humorous. Slow-paced, be now. The broth has cooled. You've stirred it 3 times clockwise, twice counterclockwise, and once with your eyes closed, just in case. If you were in a 12th century Byzantine village, this would be the moment to make your forecast. Low clouds by Thursday, dry winds through next feast day. Don't hang your laundry on St. Basil's Eve, but tonight you're not predicting the weather. You're just letting your thoughts simmer. Byzantine life, on the whole, was quiet. Most villages functioned on routines that barely change from one century to the next. Wake with the sun. Tend the goats. Stir the soup. Pray. Mend a fence. Stir again. The outside world might swirl with emperors, invaders, tax reforms, crusaders, but the soup stayed. The same dot, a pot on the fire, a spoon, a patient woman nearby, listening more than speaking in this way. The grandmothers became quiet historians, not of empires or wars, but of wind patterns, drying herbs, and the way a bean feels when it's about to split. Sometimes a wandering scribe would pass through a village. He might stay the night in a home with soup already simmering. He'd ask polite questions. How do you season your broth? How many hours do you boil the bones? The grandmother would shrug. Depends on the year. This puzzled him. He wanted details, recipes, measurements, but she had none to give. Only instinct, a weathered fingertip dipped into a pot of slow boiling truth. One such scribe, named Petros the Brief, kept a travel diary. He wrote in one entry, "I came seeking news of trade routes and left with advice about lentils." He also noted, the old women speak to their soups as if two cousins, and the broth answers. When he asked them how this worked, they gave him the same answer every time. Watch long enough and you'll see. Petros watched for 3 hours. Nothing happened. He left disappointed. 2 days later, it rained, just like they said it would. Modern scholars find this tradition inconvenient. It doesn't fit into neat boxes. You can't quantify it with data or replicate it in a lab. But there's something deeply human about it. It speaks to a world where knowledge wasn't always written down. It was passed by smell, by touch, by steam rising from a clay pot, by memories that didn't need parchment, just repetition. And repetition was something Byzantine grandmothers had in abundance. In fact, there was a saying in some villages, to know the future, ask the woman who has made the same soup 100 times. This wasn't just superstition. It was pattern recognition disguised as peasant magic. It was climate science wrapped in parsley. It was meteorology performed in an apron. And if it sounds silly to us now, that may say more about us than about them, because we forgot how to listen to quiet things. There were stories, likely exaggerated, that a few grandmothers predicted historical events using soup, a change in texture during the spring broth of 1185. The emperor would fall. An unusually bitter turn in the goat stew of 1261. The Latins would soon flee Constantinople. Did these predictions really happen? No one can say, but it's not hard to imagine a woman in a stone kitchen, sipping a spoonful and saying softly, "Something is about to shift," and then turning back to the fire. Because whether she was right or wrong didn't matter much. She still had dinner to finish. One legend tells of a village that ignored their best soup dash, sayer, in the year 1207. Agatha, the wide-eyed, warned her neighbors not to store their wheat too early. "The soup clings," she said. "The air's too damp." But the village elders were impatient. They stored the grain anyway. 2 weeks later, mold. A season lost. A lesson learned. From then on, whenever Agatha stirred her pot, the entire village paused to listen, even the chickens. Some said, eventually, the tradition became less about predicting and more about connecting. The soup wasn't just a weather forecast. It was a moment of stillness, a daily ritual, the kind of act that centers a household even if the predictions were wrong half the time. Because ultimately, the women didn't just watch the soup for omens. They watched it because it watched them back. The broth knew if you were distracted, if you were worried, if you forgot to add the bay leaf. The soup forgave. But it didn't forget. It simply adjusted quietly, like a second grandmother in the room today. In some sleepy villages nestled between old olive groves and tired monasteries, the tradition lingers, not with the same ceremony, not with councils or readings, but here and there, an elderly woman still stirs a pot and pauses. She sniffs, tilts her head, watches the steam drift upward like a prayer. Then she might say something, gentle and strange. The rosemary curls. A windy week ahead. The oil floats too fast. Better keep the goats indoors. No one argues, no one mocks. They just nod. Because in a world that spins too fast, it's comforting to believe that someone still understands what the soup is, trying to say. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, picture it: a small stone kitchen, a clay pot bubbling gently, a wooden spoon resting on the rim, and beside it, a woman who's seen 80 springs and just as many stews. She doesn't need a calendar. She doesn't need a weatherman. She has her soup, and that, most nights, is enough.